Before the clock even had struck 1, within the first hour of the invasion overall, including within which this very enormous battle occurring at Fort Hood, involving multiple tens of thousands of troops on both sides, being an enormous battle in terms of scope and scale, the artillery barrage that opened up the overall assault conducted by the coalition forces present, including the artillery battalions within the 16th Tank Division and 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigades, as well as the Chinese PLA 112th Combined Arms Brigade's own artillery battalion present, in addition to the massed artillery of the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade, and also the artillery battalion of the 17th Armored Brigade, with the 17th Armored Brigade and the 112th Combined Arms Brigade both equipped with the 155 millimeter self-propelled guns consisting of the PLZ-05 howitzers, with the Russian forces utilizing self-propelled artillery within their 16th Tank Division and 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, consisting of the self-propelled 2 S-19-MSTA-S systems, which were 152 millimeter howitzers. The Field Artillery Brigade, the 203rd of the PLA 68th Group Army, had towed howitzers in the form of the PLL-05 or PLL-01s and the PLL-66s, with the 01s being 155 millimeter and the 66s being the 152 millimeter, 2 battalions of each howitzer type, as well as 2 battalions of the PHL-81 multiple launch rocket systems and 1 battalion of the longer range, very hard hitting 300 millimeter PHL-03s, although not anywhere near the range of the longest range artillery system on Earth, the A300, which equipped most of China's regular active duty units, artillery elements. These PHL-03s were still very long range and extremely hard hitting, having an 80-mile total range. And they were 300 millimeter, making them enormous in terms of their payload capacities. These forces, within their preliminary barrage, completely crushed everything fired upon throughout the whole installation, in conjunction with the tactical ballistic missiles fired from the 950th Rocket Brigade within the 2nd Combined Arms Army of the Russian forces present throughout the entire central Texas and even in South Texas in the San Antonio area, with the 950th being present with those forces there, had a large firing radius of 310 miles, which put Fort Hood well within their range, as well as the Chinese PLA Strategic Missile Forces branch elements from the Eastern Theater Command, consisting of the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, bolstered in number by mobilized reserve elements, specifically mobilized to fire the DH-10A long-range subsonic cruise missiles, as well as the older DF-2, 3, and 4 tactical ballistic missile systems, as they would be conventionally armed and fired from TEL, or even in the case of the DF-4, from specialized scaffolding, similar to the type of scaffolding used by the North Korean ballistic missile program within Mexico to fire at American targets across the border, with the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade being a Trojan unit, initially beginning on CCP regime properties just to the east of Austin, Texas, firing a myriad of systems ranging from the DF-11As to the DF-15Bs and DF-15Cs, as well as the DF-21As. These forces, firing from their TEL systems as well, pummeled the installation in conjunction with the Russian missile forces firing their payloads. Within one more hour, the container-based calibers and YJ-18Cs within the Club K and YJ-18C container disguise systems would begin to fire on the installation as well, leaving the installation as a pockmarked moonscape, as said before. with the air defense forces moving up to perform a blocking position to net any potential escaping foot infantry, as they, of course, had small arms as well and could easily take on other foot infantry. The original forces that moved into the installation in its northeastern corner, these forces from the 17th Armored Brigade, consisting of 2 armored battalions, followed closely behind by a short-range air defense artillery battalion belonging also to the 17th Armored Brigade, equipped with their SPAAA-95 armored air defense artillery systems on tracks, followed them into the installation, where originally they were planning to attack the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, or the 1st of the 3rd, whereby they were instead diverted on a SEAD operation, as everything conducted within the scope of this operation was conducted according to not just the original battle planning, but also the fluid-changing battlefield conditions constantly updated by artificial intelligence, especially possessed by the Chinese and also even the Russians, as well as their incredible ISR assets from both nations. This ISR network picking up the Americans training in the far northeast corner of the installation, being the 1st of the 44th, a Patriot battalion, having had recent past deployments to the Middle East, including Qatar, to man Patriot systems, training with a single battery of IM SHORAD systems, which were striker-based short-range air defense systems consisting of 2 Stinger missiles, 2 Hellfire missiles for self-defense against ground vehicles, and also a 30mm autocannon that were radar-directed, but due to the fact that there was electronic warfare jamming in conjunction with the downed American satellites, both military and commercial, as well as the cyber attack launched at midnight in conjunction with the anti-SAT strikes, all redundant communications were down in the form of radio, and all the portable radar systems that weren't dependent upon the satellite or on the internet were also being jammed by the electronic warfare assets belonging to the 208th Signals Regiment of the PLA's 68th Group Army. The AN/MPQ 53s, which were the radar systems of these Patriot batteries, as well as their OE 349 antenna mast groups, were being horribly jammed by these EW systems, making it nearly impossible for the engagement control stations to be able to track, target, and intercept airborne targets. These being powered by the EPP-3 electric power plant, as in their generator system. They could not, therefore, function effectively against the now incoming PLAAF assets in the form of the J-11 fighters, which were paired with FH-97As, which originally were intended to be the wingmen drones, autonomous systems of the J-20, but could also be paired with other PLAAF aircraft, including their 4th generation J-11 aircraft, and were being tested in combat for the first time, and were paired with not just the J-20s in other areas, but also with J-11s and J-16s and JF-17s. The H-6K heavy strategic bombers, while certainly able to be targeted and tracked and targeted by the Patriot systems were unable to target them due to the jamming coming from the electronic warfare assets of the PLA ground forces. Some of these bombers were also equipped with the KG-600 jamming pods. They flew extremely high in altitude, dropping their payloads all throughout the installation, slamming motor pools and administrative buildings and other units all throughout the post. As the J-11 fighters came in, both the J-11s themselves, firing their limited numbers of air-to-ground munitions, as they were primarily armed with air-to-air munitions for the air defense, air superiority, combat air patrol role, they fired their KD-88 TV seeker guided medium range air-to-ground missiles, as did their FH-97A counterparts as they flew into the area, as these missiles had quite a long range to them of over 100 miles. These missiles were now entering the installation and were beginning to slam into the ground forces consisting of, again, the 144th, or the 1st of the 44th, rather, the 1st of the 44th, which was a battalion of Patriot systems conducting interoperability training with a single battery of SHORAD IM forces, which were from the 4th of the 5th Air Defense Artillery Battalion, both coming from the 69th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, which was stationed on Fort Hood as its home installation. As many different instances of interoperability training were occurring throughout the installation at this time, approximately a quarter of the American troops normally posted on the installation were out training, conducting mimicry of real-life combat conditions training, with live ammunition having been signed out for their personal small arms, as they'd signed them out from their batteries' armories before engaging in their training exercise, as well as live fire Patriot missiles as well as Stinger missiles to practice at shooting down drones, with their missiles being fired at the perfect trajectory in order for them to land in the impact area on the installation should they miss their target. The impact area being right in this area right here, with where these mixed armored units were firing into, where they were training together, also doing interoperability training before the invasion even kicked off, as well as these firing into this impact area right here, where these two markers are, the marker for all of 3 Corps and the marker for the 48th Chemical Brigade, which was also on the installation on the main post. Due to the map, the unit markers had to be placed just to show which units were on the installation, and they were placed in areas not necessarily where the actual units themselves were, as most were on the main post in their barracks at the time of the invasion. These forces were being engaged by an entire multitude, a whole litany of different munitions, as the armored forces were moving in to surround this particular training area, as there's a parking lot and a former range building right here at this parking lot where this peels off of the range road to get to this training area, as the same is the case here. A range road moving through the area with a bridge crossing this creek goes through here, where one of the 2 attacking armored battalions had peeled off to engage these forces during the suppression of enemy air defense operations, which took precedence over even attacking the 1st of the 3rd, with the other armored battalion staying in the area to guard their backs, their rear flank, as the other battalion surged forward to surround and destroy these forces. Everything was AI directed and ISR directed, with the artificial intelligence processing information by the second on everything and updating commanders on the ground and advising them on where and how to deploy forces and where enemy targets were at any given second, with the suppression of enemy air defenses taking top priority, just as did the special operations mission conducted by a single platoon of the Falcon Spec Ops, flown in by the first helicopters to arrive from the PLAAF's total of 15 flying in, with the other 10 arriving later after 1, between 1:05 and 1:10. The first 5 helicopters flew in that particular platoon of that particular company, the first company of the Falcon Spec Ops, to capture the lieutenant general in command over the entire 3 Corps, and by default also the post commander as well, leaving the Americans completely leaderless in terms of centralized leadership, although due to the lack of communications, as none existed other than immediate foot-based communications due to the electronic warfare jamming the redundant communications after the anti-satellite cyber strike, it was essentially up to the discretion of local commanders how they conducted their operations during this attack, because there was no central command at this point, as command and control had been nullified by the removing of communications and ISR assets on the American side, hence leaving the Americans in a worse position than the Iraqis were in the first Gulf War, unable to see and know exactly what was going on in any given moment at any given place, except for what was right upon them. As these KD-88 air-to-ground missiles flew in from being fired further away, as these trails indicate, the J-11 fighters and their drone counterparts of the FH-97As were flying in with them to conduct a strafing attack on these different Patriot firing batteries, who themselves couldn't track and fire back, although there was a section that had ran off earlier from their destroyed SHORAD forces of the SHORAD, IM SHORAD battery that was destroyed by tank fire, as the Type 96B main battle tanks of the 17th Armored Brigade, as opposed to the Type 99A main battle tanks of the 112th Combined Arms Brigade, the Type 97s, had been shooting on the move, destroying the SHORAD IM battery that was training with the Patriot Battalion, the 1st of the 44th, before even beginning to surround them, as a single entire armored battalion was now moving in, on as shown on this map, with more off map, but of course on this map there is the entire combat elements of one tank company right here, leaving its headquarters company off map. There's also the anti-tank company, which consists of the HQ-10 based AFT-10 tracked anti-tank vehicles that carry 8 HJ-10s apiece, which were very long anti-tank missiles, which had a range of 6.2 miles, or just over double what the American TOW system had, were now moving into place, while the armored forces were firing enormous quantities of shells, specifically fragmentation shells, at the different firing batteries, and some firing heat shells as well at the vehicles. With Chinese dismounted armored infantry forces from this specific armored infantry company here, as the entire battalion was comprised of 4 tank companies. This one, this platoon, this platoon, this platoon, and this platoon were the combat elements of another company. Then there was this platoon, this platoon, this platoon, and this platoon, another company, with this platoon and these two and the rest behind it being another company, leaving their headquarters platoons even further back, which were responsible for logistics and command, with the armored infantry companies moving in, as indicated as one right here, elements of another here, and elements of another right here, being 3, with the anti-tank company moving in as well, with only the headquarters company sitting off map completely. These forces now, by this time, have surrounded and were busy ripping to pieces the air defense artillery forces, which, before the invasion had occurred, some of them began to fortify their positions to mimic real-life conditions with sandbag emplacements and such, but not all batteries got that far along, such as this one right here, and was easily ripped to pieces by the KD-88 missiles, the air-to-ground missiles, CH-901As that were actually called in to the headquarters battalion's drone section of the headquarters battalion of the 90th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, being that it was closest and could support the ground forces with their drones, equipping them with the HE warheads, the drone section did, before firing them from their 48-tubed TEL-like system at this battle space to aid the troops attacking on the ground from the 17th Armored Brigade's one armored battalion committed to this particular operation, the suppression of enemy air defense operation that was happening right here, right now. The Russians would be very shortly firing their tactical ballistic missiles in the form of 2 Iskanders hitting each of these 2 batteries here, with even mortar fire called in from the heavy 120 millimeter PLL-05 self-propelled mortars / assault guns, which were even hitting this platoon element here of the headquarters battery that had just freshly delivered some Patriot missiles to this firing battery at the time that the invasion had broken out. The PLL-05 self-propelled gun mortars, assault gun mortars, came from the lone mechanized infantry battalion from the 17th Armored Brigade, supporting its other battalions of the brigade, besides its own battalion it came from, supporting the armored battalion now attacking here. The fire support company, which consisted of all platoons being PLL-05s instead of also including the smaller MLRS Type 63 based 130 millimeter systems. These were all PLL-05s, which were self-propelled assault gun mortars, and they were firing 5.5 miles to hit targets here, as they had to move in closer to do that. They had originally driven beneath the artillery fire coming from their own artillery battalion, also from the 17th Armored Brigade, which was firing their PLZ-05 heavy 155 millimeter howitzers at American forces on the map. As they were now firing from 5.5 miles away, they were just within range to hit some of the firing batteries of this particular battalion of the 141st of the 44th. They were hitting this moving headquarters platoon here from this headquarters battery, from the headquarters and support battery that was camped out right here with their tents and everything set up, and armored Humvee leading this group. And they were also hitting this firing battery and even this firing battery as well with their heavy mortar systems, destroying many of these Patriot systems as well as their M983A4s, which were their HEMTs, or heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks, which towed and also had a crane to help with the reloading process with these missiles, in addition to their AN-MPQ-53 radars, as well as their AN-MSQ-104 engagement control stations, which were essentially the command vehicles of these forces, with their OE-349 antenna mass groups, and of course their EPP-3 electric power plants, which powered these forces. They were all being hit and destroyed by CH-901A loitering munitions. Their Iskanders about to come in from their Russian allies of the coalition, launching 2 at this particular operation, whereas the armored infantry of this particular armored infantry company had dismounted at least 1 platoon, which was the forward vehicle platoon right here, with their ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicle and 4 Type 89A armor personnel carriers. As they were moving up into this area, there were 2 squads that did a closing L formation where they were firing and firing, vectoring fire 2 different ways before bounding. You know, as one would fire, one would bound and then stop fire. The next one would bound, stop fire, until they reached their limit of advance, which was when they were both basically at the closed L, so that no one would go forward any further, which would cause friendly fire. They were doing that at the same time as these loitering munitions were hitting and destroying vehicles and the radars and such, as well as the Patriot systems that were set up, in addition to the KD-88s having been fired from the drone in the form of the FH-97A stealth drone, as well as the J-11s. They were paired with firing their limited couple of missiles, their KD-88s, as they were coming in to strafe. In addition to doing so, as these missiles were now hitting, they had taken some fire from the Americans, as the SHORAD-IM systems had stingers that were radar directed, that were data directed via the radars, targeting radars on the systems, as well as they also had 2 Hellfire missile systems for self-defense, as well as a 30-millimeter autocannon system for the air defense role, but it could also be used at ground attacking assets as well. They were destroyed from farther away as these tanks were beginning to close in and surround these forces here. They were destroyed from further away by the fairly long-range 125-millimeter tank guns of the Type 96B main battle tanks before these forces even began to close in and surround these forces here. And as these aviation assets were all coming in to do their strafing attacks, as their previously earlier fired KD-88s were hitting their targets, these forces here, right here, they had retreated from their SHORAD battery as it was being attacked, and they had hurried to get to the other forces to warn them of what was going on, as the communications had completely failed due to the anti-SAT and cyber strike, as well as the electronic warfare jamming. And as these forces were coming in, they realized they were being attacked from the air, as they had to swoop down at relatively lower levels to do a successful strafing attack, pointing down at their targets. These forces fired 3 man-portable Stinger shoulder-fired missiles, which were not radar-directed and thus were not affected at all by the EW jamming, as they had an optical sight for tracking these systems. In addition, it was an enclosed system, in other words. It just had a simple sight, and the missile did the work on its own, as the missile tracked IR/UV signals. And as these forces were coming down and strafing, the J-11 got a notification here about a missile lock and jettisoned some flares before pulling up out of its strafing attack, with the wingman here, the FH-97A autonomous stealth drone, doing the same, and this one as well, as this one pulled up too. And this one here flying in between these two, as each of these autonomous vehicles was flying to the left of their pilot, that they mimicked pretty much whatever the human operator of the J-11 did, they did as well. And because they were autonomous, but they also were paired to the aircraft, and they tended to learn from the human operator what to do, they pulled up out of their attack run, jettisoned their flares and illuminated chaff, which illuminated chaff is just radar beams directed against the shaft that's jettisoned from shaft pods, making it seem like to a radar that this is an actual object. And even though the radars were jammed for the actual Patriot systems and the SHORAD-IM systems that were already destroyed by this point, it was just standard operating procedure along with the flares. And they pulled up, and the flares were what deceived the missiles. But because the missiles were in motion and this drone was in between these aircraft, the missiles were still going and hit the drone. They managed to hit the FH-97A that was paired to this aircraft and destroyed it. But the aircraft with their human pilots made it out, as well as this drone here from their strafing attack. And they managed to destroy all of these forces in conjunction with the incoming 2 Iskander missiles, which hit at the same time as this missile hit, this KD-88. This hit at the same time, as well as loitering munitions coming in and mortars, simply annihilating this entire firing battery, making it a non-element. The nose cannon rounds being very potent from these J-11s and from these FH-97As simply ripped through these sandbags and also continued to go down the line, hitting everything that was within its track of fire before they all pulled up and destroyed all of this, as well as loitering munitions and the incoming missile in the form of the Iskander landing right in the middle with these radar and command vehicles, as well as the antenna arrays and mass groups and all that. and destroyed and left a big crater right here, just as it did over here, with the mortar fire, the KD-88 air-to-ground missiles, the loitering munition strikes here, here, and here. Some of the troops ran away, but these several here running out of the area were destroyed when the Iskander hit and left a massive crater in this area where this battery had been eliminating some of the ones running away, while the others had made it taking fire. They were under heavy fire from these armored forces firing at them from way over here. This map was a 1.5 mile by 1 mile map and consisted of varied terrain features, everything from woodlands, such as what would be seen in a situation like this, where these American soldiers are firing back at these Chi-Com attackers and wedge formations and line formations coming at them and firing back at them, as well as even more fire coming from the trees behind them, as well as over here too, firing this way, and their guys here firing this way. They were taking fire through the woods, as again these vehicles, the ground vehicles, had very powerful image intensifiers, as well as they're also having IR and night vision, and of course, and they were able to see through the woodlands and fire at these forces here just as these missiles came in, all of the air-to-ground missiles, the tactical ballistic missiles, and the armored infantry troops fighting up here with the missiles coming in and loitering munitions supporting their attack as they advanced, and these other forces coming around, advancing. There were some casualties, because even before the Iskander hit this battery, these dismounted armored infantry troops crossing this little creek right here and advancing up this hill were taking fire from the Americans up here, but the mortars came in and decimated them, in addition to the loitering munitions and the KD-88 strike, as well as the ballistic missile strike, as these forces were getting closer. They didn't get too close, though, because, again, everything was AI and ISR directed. They knew that the Russians had fired a Iskander at this battery just a bit further from the center of it, so they stayed just far enough away that they wouldn't perish in the missile strike. But they had taken fire as they had crossed the creek, as indicated by these arrows, and there were a few wounded among them. The tanks were taking fire from these guys too, and although they really only had machine guns and small arms, they were going for the tank turret gunners but failed. And as this loitering munition came in, this one came in, KD-88, other loitering munition, and the tactical ballistic missile with these IFVs and APCs firing upon them as well, including the tanks. They were done for. And this battle ended relatively fast, although there's a whole lot of activity on it. It ended extremely quickly. It ended within a matter of less than 20 minutes from the entire beginning of the fighting to the end, from the beginning of destroying these SHORAD systems of the SHORAD battery that was training with, from the SHORAD battery from the 4th of the 5th, that was training with the battalion, the 1st of the 44th. The mortars, air-to-ground missiles, strafing attacks, tactical ballistic missiles, loitering munitions, tank shells, IFV shells from the 100mm ZBD-04A system, gun systems, the 30mm autocannon fire from the ZBD-04As, as well as the small arms fire from the coax machine guns from the tanks and the ZBD-04As, as well as the heavy machine gun fire from the APC turrets of the Type 89As of the armored infantry, and the small arms fire from the infantry dismounts themselves, as well as some anti-tank guided missile fire, shoulder fired from some of these dismounts, was devastating on these forces. The elevation here indicates that this is a valley, a lower valley, and as these forces had come down from where the elevation goes down gradually, like right here, they just had resupplied these troops here with their Patriot missiles before the invasion, and then they had left and went down into this valley and intended to go around off the map and back up to their campsite, which was higher up on the ground here, and was even higher than this ground, as the elevation marker shows here. And they were next to this battery here. And these batteries, the headquarters and support battery, as well as the firing battery right here, were somewhat fortified on top of their hilly positions, with this one being slightly on some higher ground and this one being on even higher ground here, as well as this one, as the elevation is somewhat steep here, but then sort of tapers off to lower elevation. But this elevation right here above the creek bed is pretty high, but tapers off to lower elevation, where this road runs through the area and crosses this bridge, this range road, and ostensibly winds through the entire rangelands with gravel or paved, in some cases, paths that go up to these little graveled parking lots. And there's range buildings for training purposes at these ranges, but they were freshly destroyed by 125 millimeter tank shells, as indicated by the fresh smoke above the rubble. And these forces moved in, and as again they took fire, the small arms and machine gun fire from these forces did literally almost nothing at all to the armor, as again it was just the best weapon they had in terms of small arms was their 50 cal, their M250 cal mounted on their MRAPs or on their up armored Humvees, which did little to nothing at all to these tanks, or even to the IFVs, although it could potentially damage a Type 89A APC. It would take a lot of fire to do so. And they fired back, and their fire was definitely felt, because 100 millimeter shells from the IFVs, 30 millimeter autocannon HE shells, blasting ammunition, as well as also their 50 cal or 12.7 millimeter Chinese 50 cal rounds would shred this area to pieces. Although the sandbag emplacements were definitely helpful, it didn't stop tank shells or any other types of munitions from doing what they did. These troops from this battery tried to run over to their headquarters and support battery's position over the battalion, but they were hit and intercepted by an HE equipped loitering munition, as this arrow is completely encapsulated in red. These guys managed to escape before the tank shells and loitering munitions completely decimated this group right here. And as they got out, they were lit up by 12.7 millimeter turret gunners, as well as the 7.62 by 54 coax fire. And their battery was destroyed by loitering munitions and heavy bombardment by tank shells from this platoon here, firing on it as they moved in, and this one firing on it. And of course, over here, they were firing up this hill at it. But many of them were also firing here as well, including their armored infantry forces and strafing forces attacking primarily this one, but also this one as well, as it was in the path. And they destroyed, the strafe attack destroyed this radar and some of these troops here in the fuel truck. And then the tactical ballistic missiles came in and finished them off. And there were wooded areas in the area as well, as indicated here, and over here by this creek junction right there on both sides of it. As again, the terrain at Fort Hood was extremely varied, and it was almost like a semi-desert mixed with scrub brush forests, and mesquite wood, and even grassland-like terrain in other areas, but it had a lot of terrain elevation variations within it, a lot of different topography, as it said. And as these dismounted armored infantry troops advanced along the bottom of this steep elevation here, they began to climb the elevation and form into a wedge formation to attack the headquarters and support battery from the back, essentially, firing 35 millimeter barrel fired grenades from beneath their rifle barrels at those that had them, as well as throwing hand grenades when within hand grenade range, like this point man here. But all the while, they were taking fire early on, as again, all of these things are happening at roughly the same time, with the very last moves being these tactical ballistic missiles coming in and the aircraft pulling up out of their strafe attack. All the rest of this is happening either before or during that, in conjunction with that, with the missiles coming in and mortars coming in, hitting this headquarters platoon element that was doing a resupply training operation, as well as this incoming, or these 3 incoming loitering munitions, mortars, and KD-88 missiles, air-to-ground missiles, tank shells, infantry fighting vehicle fire, and even dismounted infantry fire, as this double column formation advancing here is taking heavy fire early on before all this different munition fire impacts. They had lost 2 troops as they got into their firefight with these American headquarters troops here, as indicated by the 2 guys surrounded in green here. This squad here, forming into a wedge after they all get up here, lost a single soldier as well. And there was a 4th soldier that was KIA'd over here. But no vehicles of the PLA forces were lost to any American fire. Although they had lost some of their dismounted ground troops, they didn't lose any vehicles. And as the PLA lost 4 KIAs, the Americans lost drastically more, as these loitering munitions coming in and hitting these areas, the mortar fire from 120 millimeter heavy assault gun mortars, the air-to-ground missiles and strafing, the tank shell fire, IFV fire, APC fire, ground dismounted troop fire, just decimated these forces. They decimated them. And there were some that surrendered, as initially at the beginning, these guys on this higher elevation in the prone position were firing over these guys on lower elevation, also in the prone. They were firing in a sort of layered fire, like a tiered fire over one another at these armored forces, as well as these troops firing from behind this rubbled area, vectoring fire over here and even through the woods as these tanks moved up. And also, of course, these guys vectoring fire over here in support. After the SHORAD IM SHORAD battery here was destroyed from the 4th of the 5th, they were all firing at these vehicles and even this platoon here as it moved up, but they were all destroyed as these forces pincered them, these dismounts pincered them with the oncoming armored forces, loitering munition support, and of course the heavy firepower of the tanks themselves, as well as the armored infantry's vehicles, in conjunction with everything else. And although the Americans had a relatively small success, and they did actually shoot down a stealth drone that was coming down to strafe with these, mimicking their paired aircraft that they were each paired to, they did destroy this one with all of their 3 shoulder-fired Stinger systems, but they were destroyed in turn. They were wiped out, as these troops had done their closing L, cleared this area out, advanced here, and they tried to fire back, but they were just mopped up, and this tactical ballistic missile just cratered this area. They were safe enough away as this came in. And these forces, as they were coming in, they were taking fire too, but they stopped safely away as this missile just destroyed all this. The armor took fire through the woods, and as these forces ran this way to try to flee, they just mowed them down, as this arrow encapsulated in red indicates, and these first 3 guys encapsulated in red indicates. This escape was before the tactical ballistic missile came in there at the end, and they were mowed down by the armor, firing from 2 different ways. Their heavy machine gun fire and coax machine gun fire, they just lit them up. It was a very brutal but very short-lived overall battle, as all the forces maneuvered into place and achieved a lightning victory. And again, as these troops ran out, again, they were eliminated by these armored forces, as this encapsulated red indicates. They were all eliminated by the mortars, KD-88s, CH-901A loitering munition strikes, and course, the dismount infantry and armor. Just after 1 a.m., at the conclusion of the SEAD operations, minutes afterward, as scenes like this had unfolded throughout the operation, the forces on the ground were waging a war of utter annihilation as it pertained to the coalition, but another one of utter survival as it pertained to the Americans, with these forces, the 4th of the 9th Cav Regiment, which is part of the 2nd Brigade of 1st Cav, had fled immediately. They were right near North Fort Hood, and as they heard the impacts and they heard the shelling and the missile strikes and everything erupting from miles around. I mean, this is a massive area, but there were strikes going on everywhere. It was a huge area and had to be covered by literally multiple tens of thousands of shells and munitions, missiles, all of it. They had heard the blasting and they fled along with these troops that were patrolling, these mixed companies of troops here that were practicing combat patrols with one another, interoperability training. And artillery began to hit near them too, so they fled early on with these Cav forces of this Cav battalion from 1st Cav, the 4th of the 9th. And also 2nd Squadron of 3rd ACR fled later on as the Russians had came in and would defeat the 1st of the 3rd Squadron, 1st Squadron, 3rd ACR. They would come after and chase away the 2nd Squadron of 3rd ACR, who would escape with the other troops. Some of them would definitely not survive, as they would be attempted to be pursued and cut off, as well as others going toward the highway where PLA units would destroy them. Others would make it to Waco and put up another fight there, but that's a different battle. As other units were slicing throughout the installation, there was a whole myriad of combat going on there, including also even combat outside of the installation, as early on, PLA forces, as part of a vital operation to capture the interstate, had captured the city of Temple, but there were residents there who decided to put up a fight, to put up a struggle against the occupation forces that were now in control of most of their city, as these forces had been herded into a very small area by this armored battalion that entered the city and began to methodically go through it and in an attempt to clear the areas adjacent to the interstate through the city, as cities were key nodes as far as transportation went as it related to interstates, and the possibility of guerrilla warfare around the highways in an urban setting was a potential nightmare scenario for the external components that would be coming through the area, so it was incumbent that the Trojans clear urban areas adjacent to the highway of any and all armed resistance, whether military or civilian or even paramilitary, if applicable, in the case of the Americans. So the PLA forces here were going to clear Temple of its armed resistance as the battle raged. Belton was under complete control by this point, as was Nolanville, which was very close to I-35, as PLA forces had moved in to ensure that they controlled the city between its artillery forces present, these other 3, or rather 4 moving in here, and the headquarters unit of the 112th Cav moving in here, even an armored battalion moving down and into Nolanville to ensure that the gateway to I-35 from the central Texas area, consisting of Fort Hood and Killeen and Harker Heights and Cove, was secured from this end to where enemy forces couldn't somehow, some way, slip out of the battle space and make it to the interstate. Just like these air defense forces up here were blocking the escape to the interstate, there were other forces off the map beginning to do the same. control of I-35 was, again, of the most paramount importance. All major cities along it, including all of the central Texas area, fairly medium-sized, and some small cities, likewise had to be controlled, as Fort Hood was being smashed at the same time, which was an enormous priority in and of itself. The hypothetical invasion documentary through the guise of fourth-generation warfare will continue with the Battle of Fort Hood in the next video within this documentary series.